Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be back at Denton Bible Church. Several years ago, this church helped to sponsor a debate on the resurrection of Jesus at the University of North Texas with the liberal radical Jesus seminar scholar Marcus Borg. And so this is a church that is committed to the defense of the faith and the value of apologetics. And this conference is simply a continuing manifestation of that commitment. So I commend this church for its commitment to the life of the mind as a vital part of Christian discipleship, and I'm grateful to be part of this conference this afternoon. J.P. Moreland, in his talk, explained to us that there are three worldviews vying for the allegiance of the American people today. Ethical monotheism, which is represented by Christianity, postmodernism, and scientific naturalism. And he explained that scientific naturalism has both an epistemology, that is a theory of knowledge, as well as an ontology, that is to say a theory of reality. And the ontology or theory of reality of scientific naturalism is that all that exists is the physical world, the material world. David Armstrong, who is a prominent naturalistic philosopher, characterizes naturalism in the following way, and I quote, "Naturalism is the doctrine that reality consists of nothing but a single, all-embracing spatio-temporal system." So according to this view then, all that exists is the physical contents of space and time. And the question that I propose to explore with you this afternoon is this: is that true? Is there nothing but the physical contents of space and time? I want to look this afternoon with you at several reasons to think that that is not the case. I believe that as we explore the physical world, we encounter, as it were, signposts of transcendence pointing beyond the physical world to its ground in a transcendent reality. And today I want to sketch briefly 5 aspects of the world which suggest that there is indeed a transcendent reality undreamt of in naturalistic philosophy. Now, whole books have been written on each one of these reasons. And if you'd like to explore them further, I'd suggest you take a look, for example, at my treatment in the conference book, On Guard, in which 4 of these are discussed, or Reasonable Faith, in which all 5 are discussed in some detail. And I'm hoping, if we have time, that we'll have a little bit of time after my talk for some questions from you on any of these arguments. So, number 1 then, why anything at all exists. This is the contingency argument for God. This is the deepest question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? In his biography of the great Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, Norman Malcolm reports that Wittgenstein said that he sometimes had a certain experience which could best be described by saying that when I have it, I wonder at the existence of the world. I am then inclined to use such phrases as, how extraordinary that anything should exist, or how extraordinary that the world should exist. This mystery, which according to Aristotle lay at the very foundation of philosophy, is one that even thoughtful naturalists cannot avoid. For example, Derek Parfit, a naturalistic philosopher, agrees, and I quote, that no question is more sublime than why there is a universe, why there is anything rather than nothing. Now, experience teaches that, premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or else in an external cause. Now, this principle seems quite plausible, at least more so than it's contradictory. Imagine that you were hiking in the hills and came across a translucent ball lying on the ground. You would naturally wonder how the ball came to be there. And if one of your hiking buddies said to you, just forget about it, it just exists with no explanation, you'd either think that he was kidding or that he just wanted you to keep moving. But nobody would take seriously the suggestion that the ball literally exists for no explanation whatsoever. And notice that merely increasing the size of the ball to, say, the size of a house, or the size of a continent, or the size of a planet, or a galaxy, or even to the size of the universe, would do nothing to either provide or remove the need for an explanation of its existence. So, according to this first principle then, everything that exists is one of two types. The first type is something that exists necessarily, by a necessity of its own nature. Examples? Well, many mathematicians think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical objects exist in this way. If such entities exist, then they just exist necessarily, without any cause of their existence. The other type of thing is anything that has an external cause of its existence. Examples? People, mountains, planets, galaxies. They have causes outside themselves which explain why they exist. Now, it seems obvious that premise 2, the universe, exists. And from these two premises, it follows logically that the universe has an explanation of its existence. But what sort of explanation could the universe have? Well, it seems plausible that 3, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external, transcendent, personal cause. Why? Because the cause of the universe must be greater than the universe. Think of the universe, all of space and time. So the cause of the universe must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only two kinds of things that could possibly fit that description. Either abstract objects, like numbers or other mathematical entities, or else an unembodied mind. That is to say, a personal intelligence or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, has no effects upon anything. So abstract objects cannot be the cause of the origin of the universe, and therefore it follows logically that 4, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause. That is to say, there exists an unembodied mind which created the universe, which is what most people traditionally mean by God. So it seems to me that this is a sound argument for thinking that the explanation why anything exists rather than nothing is to be found in a personal, transcendent mind which is necessary in its being and which is the cause of the contingent universe. Reason number 2, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Was there a beginning to the universe? Or does it just go back and back and back forever? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But there are good reasons, I think, both philosophically and scientifically, to doubt that that is the case. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past seems absurd. Just think about it. If the universe never had a beginning, then the series of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. For example, if you had an infinite number of coins, and they were numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, and I took away all of the odd-numbered coins, how many coins would you have left? Well, an infinite number, all of the even-numbered coins. So, infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all of the coins numbered 4 or greater, 4, 5, 6, and so on out to infinity. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, just 3. So, infinity minus infinity is 3. In fact, in each case, I took away the same number of coins from the same number of coins, and yet came up with contradictory answers. Indeed, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer from 0 to infinity. This shows that the idea of infinity is merely a concept in your mind, not something that actually exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, states the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play, he concluded, is solely that of an idea. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't just go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. Now, this purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but in fact had an absolute beginning about 13 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. And what makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Now, of course, alternative theories have been proposed over the years to try to avoid the absolute beginning predicted by the standard Big Bang theory. But none of these theories has commended itself to the scientific community as more plausible than the Big Bang theory. In fact, in the year 2003, 3 cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe, which is, on average, in a state of cosmic expansion, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Vilenkin pulls no punches. This is what he writes, and I quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." That problem was very nicely captured by Anthony Kinney of Oxford University. He writes, and I quote, "A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." But surely that doesn't make sense, for such a conclusion is, in the words of the philosopher of science Bernhard Königscheider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize this argument thus far as follows. Premise one: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist, from which it follows logically. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion follows necessarily. Now, from the very nature of the case, as the cause of space and time, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we must come to an absolutely first uncaused cause. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must also transcend space as well, and therefore must be an immaterial being, not anything physical. Moreover, I would argue this cause must also plausibly be personal. Think about it. How else could a timeless, changeless cause give rise to a temporal effect with a beginning like the universe? If the cause were just a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. If the sufficient conditions are present, the effect must be present as well. For example, suppose the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. If the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water to just begin to freeze a finite time ago. So if the cause is permanently present, the effect should be permanently present as well. The only way for the cause to be timeless and the effect to begin to exist a finite time ago is if the cause is a personal agent who is endowed with freedom of the will and therefore has the ability to spontaneously create a new effect in time without any antecedent determining conditions. For example, a man who has been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up, and thus you would have an effect with the beginning arise from an eternal cause. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number three, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. During the last 40 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent life depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once thought that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually intelligent life might evolve somewhere in the cosmos. But now we know to the contrary that the existence of intelligent life is balanced on a knife's edge of incomprehensible precision. The existence of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to a degree that literally defies human comprehension and is therefore incalculable. Now, this fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants. For example, the gravitational constant, G, which stands for the force of gravity. Now, these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants. Secondly, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are simply put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature then operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the early universe, or the balance between matter and antimatter. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were the values of these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. For example, P.C.W. Davies has calculated that a change in the strength of the subatomic weak force by even 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. The cosmological constant, which drives the inflationary expansion of the universe, has been inexplicably observed to be fine-tuned to around 1 part out of 10 to the 120th power. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of the Big Bang's initial low entropy condition existing by chance alone are on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, a number which is so incomprehensible that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. Penrose said, "I cannot even recall seeing anything else in physics whose accuracy is known to approach even remotely a figure like 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123. And it's not just each constant or quantity that must be exquisitely fine-tuned. Their ratios to one another must also be delicately fine-tuned. So improbability is multiplied by improbability until our minds are reeling in incomprehensible numbers. Now, there are 3 possibilities for explaining this remarkable fine-tuning of the universe. Either physical necessity, chance, or design. If we could have the first premise there. Physical necessity, chance, or design. The first alternative, physical necessity, holds that there's some unknown theory of everything that would explain the way the universe is. It had to be that way. And there was really no chance or little chance of the universe's not being life-permitting. By contrast, the second alternative, chance, states that the fine-tuning of the universe is due entirely to accident. It's just by chance that the universe is life-permitting, and we're the lucky beneficiaries. The third alternative, design, rejects both of these accounts in favor of an intelligent mind behind the cosmos who designed the universe to be life-permitting. And the question is, which of these 3 alternatives is the most plausible explanation? Well, the first alternative seems extraordinarily implausible because, as I've explained, the values of the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants and quantities. For example, the most promising candidate for a theory of everything to date, so-called superstring theory or M theory, allows for a cosmic landscape of around 10 to the 500th power different possible universes, all consistent with nature's laws, but varying in the values of their constants. So that M theory does nothing to explain why the constants have the observed values that they do, or to render them physically necessary. So what about the second alternative, that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe's being life-permitting are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. Even though there will be a huge number of life-permitting universes lying within the cosmic landscape, nevertheless, the number of life-permitting worlds will be unfathomably tiny compared to the entire landscape, so that a dart thrown randomly at the cosmic landscape would have no meaningful chance of striking a life-permitting universe. Therefore, in order to rescue the alternative of chance, its proponents have been forced to resort to the remarkable hypothesis that there exists an infinite number of randomly ordered parallel universes, undetectable by us, comprising a sort of world ensemble or multiverse, of which our universe is but a part. And somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear by chance alone, and we happen to be in one such world. There are, however, at least two major failings of the world ensemble hypothesis. First, there's no evidence that such a world ensemble even exists. Nobody knows if there are other universes, much less that they are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities and infinite in number. Moreover, recall that Borde, Guth, and Vilenkin proved that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Their theorem applies to the multiverse as well. And therefore, since the multiverse has only a finite past, only a finite number of other universes may have been generated by now, so that there's no guarantee whatsoever that a finely tuned universe will have appeared by now somewhere in the world ensemble. Secondly, if our universe is just a random member of an infinite world ensemble, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that we should be observing a much different universe than what we in fact observe. Roger Penrose has calculated that it is incomprehensibly more probable that our solar system should suddenly form by the random collision of particles than that a finely tuned universe should exist. In fact, Penrose calls it utter chicken feed by comparison. So, if our universe were just a random member of an infinite world ensemble, it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing an island of order no larger than our solar system. For there are far more observable universes in the world ensemble like that than universes which are fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life. Or again, if our universe were just a member of a randomly ordered world ensemble, then we ought to be observing extraordinary events like horses popping into being and going out of being through the random collision of particles, or pink bunny rabbits with bass drums popping in and out of existence through the random collision of particles. Because these sorts of things are incomprehensibly more probable than the fact that a finely tuned universe should exist. Observable universes like those are simply vastly, vastly more plenteous in the world ensemble than finely tuned worlds like ours, and therefore ought to be observed by us. Since we do not have such observations, that fact strongly disconfirms the multiverse hypothesis. On naturalism, at least, it is therefore highly probable that there is no world ensemble. And thus it seems that premise 2, the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or to chance, from which it follows logically, therefore, it is due to design. Now, detractors of design will sometimes object that on this hypothesis, the cosmic designer remains unexplained. It's said that an intelligent mind also exhibits complex order, so that if the universe needs an explanation, so does its designer. And if you say the designer does not need an explanation, well, then why think that the universe does? This objection is based upon a misconception of the nature of explanation. It is widely recognized that in order for an explanation to be the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, if that were required, you would have to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. And then an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. It generates an infinite regress, and nothing could ever be explained, and science would be destroyed. So you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. So, for example, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, the best explanation of this would be that it was left there by extraterrestrial intelligent agents. And that would be the best explanation, even if we had no explanation whatsoever who these agents were or how they came to be there. That can be left an open question. Now, in exactly the same way, the design hypothesis as being the best explanation of the fine-tuning doesn't depend on our being able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. But in any case, the complexity of a mind is not really comparable to the complexity of the universe. I think there's a fundamental confusion by the atheists here. A mind's ideas may be complex, yes, but a mind itself is a remarkably simple entity. It is an immaterial entity, not composed of pieces or separable parts. And therefore, it is extraordinarily simple because it has no parts. Moreover, properties like intelligence and consciousness and so forth, they're not contingent properties which a mind could lack. They're essential to its nature. So a mind is really an incredibly simple explanation, which definitely represents an advance over postulating an undesigned cosmos with all of its contingent and variegated constants and quantities. Number 4, objective moral values and duties in the world. If naturalism is true, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, to say that there are objective moral values and duties is to say that something is right or wrong, good or evil, independently of whether any human being thinks it to be so. For example, it's to say that Nazi anti-Semitism was wrong, even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought that it was right. And it would still be wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them, so that everybody thought that the Holocaust was good. And the claim here is that in the absence of God, moral values and duties are not objective in that sense. So, premise 1 is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, many atheists and theists alike agree on this point. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, one of the most influential atheists of our time, admitted, and I quote, "If there are objective values, They make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God." End quote. Instead of inferring God's existence, however, Mackey chose to deny that objective moral values and duties exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." Michael Ruse, an agnostic philosopher of science, agrees. He explains, and I quote, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." End quote. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And like Mackey and Ruse, I have to confess that I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, human morality would be objective. After all, on a naturalistic view, what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe which are destined to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the naturalistic view, some action, say rape, may not be biologically or socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development, it's become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On a naturalistic view, there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. This kind of behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong that imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is, premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. The reasoning of Michael Ruse at best proves that our subjective perception of objective moral values has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, then our gradual, fallible perception of the moral realm no more undermines the objectivity of that realm than our fallible, gradual perception of the physical world undermines the reality of the physical realm. And I think most of us recognize that in moral experience, we do apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties. In fact, Michael Ruse himself confesses in another place, and I quote, "The man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Here he ascribes to moral truths the same sort of logical necessity that characterizes mathematical truths. Actions like rape, torture, and incest aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, tolerance, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Finally, number 5, the very possibility of God's existence. Now, I've rarely shared this argument in a public talk before, not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that people who hear it are apt to think it's either some kind of a trick or that they don't understand it. But this afternoon, I want to take a risk and share it with you. Now, in order to understand this argument, you need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It is a complete description of reality. So a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that are not in fact true, but could have been true. And to say that something exists in some possible world is to say there is some description of reality that includes that entity that could have been true. To say that something exists in every possible world is to say that no matter which description you pick, this entity will be included somewhere in that description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that mathematical objects like numbers exist in every possible world. Now, with that background in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observed, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. Thus, God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So, what would such a being be like? Well, he would be omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every possible world. So if God's existence is even possible, he exists in every possible world and therefore in the actual world. We can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1, it's possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7, therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 through 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers today would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. So the whole question is premise one. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is logically incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The concept of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world seems perfectly coherent. And moreover, we've seen that there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's possible that such a being exists. So I'll just leave it to you. Do you think, as I do, that it's at least possible that God exists? If it does, then it follows logically that God does exist. So, in conclusion then, I think we've seen 5 signposts of transcendence in the world around us, pointing beyond the world to its ground in a transcendent reality. Why anything at all exists. The origin of the universe from nothing. The fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. The existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, and the very possibility of God's existence. Taken together, these 5 reasons, I think, present a powerful cumulative case for thinking that the answer to our question today is no, the physical world is not all there is. There is a transcendent, necessary, personal, all-good being which has created the world and brought us into existence. And for that reason, I am enthusiastically a theist. Thank you. Now, we've got about 5 minutes. I like to take questions from my audience, and so there's a microphone right here in the middle of this center aisle. If anyone would like to ask a question, go immediately to the mic, and I'll do my best to respond to your question. And don't wait. Go ahead and line up, and we'll see what we can do here in 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, well, you just gave the ontological argument, and I had a question about that first premise. Most atheists will bring up the objection that if you begin with the premise that it's possible that God does not exist, then you would conclude that a maximally great being does not exist. And you also said that before an atheist could say that the first premise of your argument is false, he would have to make some argument that God's existence is incoherent. But by the same reasoning, wouldn't you have to give some reason to think that the non-existence of God is incoherent before you could deny their premise?
Well, I don't think you have to show that the non-existence of God is incoherent. All you have to do is give reasons to think that the existence of a maximally great being is a coherent idea. And this is what I try to do when I defend the premise, for example, in reasonable faith. I appeal to our modal intuitions that we can see when we think about it, that this is a coherent idea. And then I give some other reasons why I think that the concept of God is coherent. But for today's purposes, my argument is much more modest. I didn't try to defend premise one. I'm just leaving it with you or with your atheist friend that you're talking to. Just say, do you think that God's existence is at least possible? If it is, then you should agree that God exists. And so for this purpose, I haven't tried to defend that first premise, but you can look at reasonable faith for a defense of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Lane Craig, this is going back to your cosmological argument about the absurdity of an infinite number of prior events. And what you did there was express how infinity numerically can get absurd. Now, when infinity is applied to an infinite God, and we're talking about his attributes, how do we prevent that type of a response coming back to us? But you say God is infinite, but you've just blown away the whole argument about infinite in a physical sense.
Good question. What I would want to do here is say that I am talking about the notion of a mathematical or quantitative infinite. But when theologians talk about God's infinity, it is not a quantitative notion. It's a qualitative notion. When we speak of God's infinity, we mean things like his moral perfection, his eternity, his omnipotence, his omniscience. These are not quantitative concepts. God isn't a set or a collection made up of an infinite number of definite and discrete finite parts. So the argument is against the existence of a quantitative infinite, but it has nothing to do with the idea of God as being qualitatively infinite in having all of these superlative attributes, which are not quantitative. Yes?
Dr. Craig, in both books that you co-authored and edited with Dr. Moreland, the Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview and the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you mentioned the cosmological argument, but you also call it the Kalam cosmological argument. Is there a difference, or is there something added onto it?
The question here is about the label that I gave to my second argument today, the cosmological argument, and I referred to the first one as the contingency argument. These are really two versions of the cosmological argument. One would be the argument from contingency, the other one from the beginning of the universe. When I did my doctoral studies in Britain on that cosmological argument, I came to appreciate the medieval Muslim contribution to the development of this argument historically. And the movement within Muslim theology that developed this argument to a high degree of sophistication is called Kalam. It means word or theology. And so I dubbed the argument the Kalam cosmological argument to recognize the historical contribution to it by these medieval Muslim theologians. Yes?
You once said that in a debate that you believe that God was the best explanation for the existence of abstract objects. And this problem is actually common to both atheists and theists. For the atheist, the question would be, is God an invisible, is reason, that is, an invisible intellectual friend? Now,
say that again, please.
Is reason, at least for the objectivist, rationalist type of atheist, is reason being treated as an invisible intellectual friend? Now, I posted an argument about this in the forum just in the last few days, but my question for you is, if I am an atheist and you and I get together and decide we're really going to solve this issue once and for all, aren't both of us assuming a kind of criterial object made up of our assumptions about reason, about formal logic, language rules, the value of inquiry and other values? What is the status of that set of criterial assumptions with which we approach the issue in the first place?
Okay, you have asked a very deep technical question. What I would say is that the difference between people who believe in the reality of these abstract objects like numbers and sets and so forth, and people who think that these things don't really exist, but they're just kind of useful fictions, it really comes down to a deep-seated difference in the kind of, I'll use a word here, semantic principles with which they approach these subjects. The people who believe in their reality tend to think that when you say there is something, that you are committed to its objective existence and reality. So if I say there is a prime number between 2 and 4, all of us would say, well, yeah, of course there's a prime number between 2 and 4. And so the realist would say, aha, you've just admitted numbers exist. I proved my point. There is a number 3. Whereas the people on the other side would say, no, look, just by saying there is something, I'm not making an ontological commitment. I say things like this. There are deep differences between Republicans and Democrats, but that doesn't commit me to some objects in the world called differences. Or if I say there was a lack of integrity in his behavior, that doesn't commit me to the reality of lacks, whatever those are. I can say there is with lots of things to which I'm not ontologically committed. And so what you will need to do is argue about which one of you has the better semantics of language to see what our ontological commitments are. And that is the very project in which I'm currently embarked and have been for about the last 10 years.
But what about
But
the
now
authority problem?
we're out of time now, so I need to cut it off, and I'll be around afterwards to discuss further. But I think you can just see here, this is just the tip of an iceberg, friends, and there is a whole rich intellectual wealth of resources for you to follow up on after this conference. The great thing about the Christian faith is that it's simple enough for a little child to understand it and appropriate, and yet it is deep enough that it can never be exhausted by the most brilliant philosopher in all his lifetime. So I hope that for those of you who have embarked on this intellectual engagement, I wish you bon voyage. I would encourage those of you in the Dallas area here to get in touch with Chris Shannon, become a part of the local Reasonable Faith chapter, where together with other like-minded Christians you can explore and talk about these issues. And I wish you all the best as you continue to intellectually engage with your faith and to share your faith with others.